As I went down to the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the robe and crown, good Lord, show me the way.
In 1940, it is estimated that 2.3 billion people inhabited the Earth. By 1945, the world population would be reduced by 3%. In the space of 5 years, the Second World War stole from the Earth the lives of 70 to 85 million people.
The war would change institutions of government and rearrange patterns of society. When hostilities ceased, and as geographical borders were redrawn, the boundaries of gender would be redefined as well.
For centuries, patriarchy had consistently asserted its power, whether in governments or in ruling bodies of the church.
At First Presbyterian Church of Brooklyn, paintings and photographs of its male pastors and session members stare down from their picture frames in hallways and meeting rooms where they used to preside, and where their church continued to be governed by male leadership, unquestioned under the gaze of their silent witness.
During the war, perceptions of a woman's place in the home, the workforce, and the church would be challenged. For First Church, a struggle would emerge within the walls of its own sanctuary, initiated by those who had stubbornly loved and lived for their church all along.
Before there was a First Church, there were church women. Their names appear, along with the names of 62 men, in a subscription book from 1822. They were
Lydia Webster,
Elizabeth Wolcott,
Anne Smith,
And Mary Bandecker.
each signed their name as occupants of the village of Brooklyn to pledge money
for the purpose of building on a certain parcel of ground a Presbyterian church.
The 4 women contributed a total of $90 towards the sanctuary's construction. Then, their names slipped quietly into the history of the church they helped to build.
118 years later, in the spring of 1940, 25 women members of First Presbyterian signed a letter to the session, the governing body of the church, requesting that women be added to positions of leadership. 9 churches in the Brooklyn-Nassau Presbytery already had women on session. 4 churches had women serving on the board of trustees, and many others had women serving as deacons. The session offered a response.
That we would give this request very careful consideration. We are not opposed to the principle of women on the boards, but it would require great care in their selection.
The answer was announced 8 months later in the December 1940 issue of The Lantern.
Some of the members of this congregation were strongly for this plan, and others just as strongly against it. Finally, it was decided that, as a first step in the direction of larger official representation, a women's council should be formed to hold meetings separately and, at times, with the session, and in that way, the women of the church would have a larger voice in formulating the policies and conducting the business of the church. These women were duly elected to serve for 1 year.
Mrs. Theodore Burgess Brown, Miss Grace Collins, Mrs. James L. Edwards, Miss Isabel F.
This
Iden.
newly founded committee joined a long list of women's associations at First Presbyterian, but only the Women's Council was formed to advise the elders of the church.
Reverend Elliott sought to educate his congregation on women leaders of the church during his Wednesday evening lectures. He began with Catherine of Siena.
Her dream of unity is one which, in our confused and broken world, we need to dream again today. A true mystic, constantly aware of the presence of God, she had the capacity to see the divine possibilities in all men.
As to the divine possibilities in all women, they would extend beyond semantics to challenge foundational issues in church leadership. In most religious and secular institutions, leadership roles exclusively assigned to men derived their authority from an unspoken assumption that was affirmed by biblical and secular history, and with language infused by the universal presence of the male pronoun.
In May of 1941, Elliot was invited by the Board of Foreign Missions to strengthen the work of missionaries in such Far East locations as Hong Kong, Thailand, and Manila, and then visit mission stations in Africa before returning home to New York. While he was on this journey, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. America was suddenly at war with the Axis powers of Japan, Italy, and Germany. After a dangerous 7 months of travel, Elliot returned home, where his family and his congregation had been following his progress with a mixture of apprehension for his safety and pride in his courage.
The struggle for women's increased participation in church governance was superseded by the war effort. Women found new ways to serve their church and their country.
In January of 1942, 1 month after America entered the war, the Young Women's Dinner Group met in the parish hall to hear an instructor from the American Women's Voluntary Services. She lectured them on air raid precautions. As the Lantern described it, the course was continued on Tuesday and Wednesday evenings for a study of poison gas.
In one edition of The Lantern from 1942, 26 men from First Church were listed in service to the armed forces. In the course of the war, and as hundreds of thousands of women entered military service, the names of women members of the First Church congregation were added as well.
When America went to war, those citizens who could not put on uniforms were invited to serve in other ways.
In poster art, Americans were summoned to train for the Red Cross, plant victory gardens, and recycle household items. Metal, rubber, paper, and animal fats were desperately needed to provide the raw material for tanks, planes, and explosives.
Get your used fat into the fight. Put it in any clean can and rush it to your meat dealer. It will help win the war.
Housewives collected bacon grease and used kitchen pans. These, along with paper, rope, and the rubber from spent car tires, could all be repurposed into the war effort. America became a place where the overlooked and the cast aside had the potential for transformation.
In posters of the time, women were depicted as vicariously joining the war and, more significantly, helping their husbands, all from their own kitchens.
Approximately 6 million women entered the defense industries. African American women stepped into jobs to support the war effort, but found racism waiting for them when they arrived. While factories were integrated, Black women encountered resentment from some of their white female co-workers. Meanwhile, the Red Cross required that donated blood be separated by race.
Young African American women dedicated themselves to a campaign called the Double V, which stood for Victory Overseas and Social Justice at Home. At Howard University, where the male enrollment had gone off to war, female students held sit-ins at a segregated diner and carried signs that read, "We die together, why can't we eat together?"
Meanwhile, a picture of a wartime female defense worker emerged, made famous by Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post cover. The public had already come to know her as the central figure in a popular song, Rosie the Riveter. Rockwell was inspired by Michelangelo's Isaiah from the Sistine Chapel and paintings of the Virgin Mary. He even graced his subject with a halo.
Her image conflated traditional perceptions of male and female, and in her cross-gendered power, she seemed to be winning the war on her lunch break.
She appeared fiercely individual, but her profile spoke for millions of her sisters who punched time cards in defense plants across America.
This was the iconic portrait that helped to popularize the image of the patriotic female. But it did not accurately reflect the image of all women defense workers.
There were approximately 600,000 African American women who performed the same kind of service. Many of these Black Rosies, as they were called, held prior jobs as domestic workers, but found sudden opportunities in a field that offered them the chance to serve their country and to earn higher wages.
They became riveters themselves and helped build a variety of aircraft, including the famous B-17 Flying Fortress, which took 394,484 rivets to assemble. The contributions of these women would remain largely unacknowledged until years after their wartime service had concluded.
By 1944, service wives with spouses overseas were gathering at First Presbyterian twice a month to offer support to one another and to women from other cities. Late in the war, on April 19, 1945, First Church member Malcolm Bigelow was killed in action, leaving a wife and infant behind. The war in Europe ended less than 3 weeks later.
In June of 1945, Dr. Eliot preached a sermon on the subject of home, using the parable of the prodigal son and his joyous return to his native land. He pointed out that only that week, 5 ships with returning soldiers had sailed into New York Harbor. Men were coming home to take up the unfinished business of America's future. Implicit in this return was the assumption that those who had so successfully labored during their absence were now about to be displaced.
Women, both Black and white, who had worked in defense plants had largely saved their money to secure their own futures or to make down payments on new homes. But for all their justified claim to economic independence, married women by mid-century still could not open bank accounts or secure bank loans without a counter-signature from their husbands.
The scrap and salvage drives of the war years had now ceased. America recalibrated itself to fit the needs of peacetime life. Raw metal and rubber were once more restored to their household usefulness, and women were refitted back to their domestic roles. Some accepted this return, others found that their lives had changed forever.
In 1947, First Presbyterian marked the centennial of the construction of its sanctuary on Henry Street. It commissioned a book celebrating the church's history, The Tower in the Heights. In his conclusion, its author, Ralph Foster Weld, offered the following.
First Church today is the true heir of First Church of yesterday. It has been the genius of the church to serve the community in each succeeding epoch according to its changing needs. It is a dignified, conservative church closely woven into Brooklyn's social fabric.
Weld's assessment was accurate. Throughout the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s, First Church's congregation was conservative, and its racial composition was, as it always had been, white. The direction of the church remained male-oriented.
As a decision-making body, the session proved resistant to allowing women a share in its leadership.
In 1952, Dr. Eliot attended the Presbyterian General Assembly and reported back to his congregation.
The trend of various churches towards representation by women on their sessions seemed to be steadily growing. Quite a number of the commissioners were members of the gentler sex, and at a rough estimate, the majority of churches had female elders.
The authority to select new session members was restricted to the session alone and not to the senior pastor. Eliot's leadership rested on his ability to guide, but not goad, his church into accepting change.
Incrementally, this occurred. In 1955, 3 women were approved by session to serve as deacons at First Presbyterian. Their function, to provide pastoral care for the church and its community, was a crucial advance in their service, although it was still subordinate to the leadership of the elders.
In 1961, Phillips Packer Elliott died at the age of 59. He had served First Presbyterian for 29 years. His death came suddenly and shocked his congregation. His eloquence and faith had guided them through the war, and his Christian curiosity invited them to investigate a world larger than the comforts of their own Brooklyn community.
He did not live to see the vote in 1963, where the first woman was elected to the Board of Trustees, and how in 1964, the session and the board would unite, making a woman trustee a new member of session, followed a year later by 2 more women, and then 1 year later by still another.
By 1966, 1/3 of the deacons were women.
By 1973, an equal number of women and men served as elders.
And in the same year, the first woman was elected clerk of session.
For the women in First Presbyterian, change came with deceptive suddenness. For years, it seemed impossible.
Until it was inevitable.
Church women had served First Presbyterian from the very first signatories on a promissory note of 1822. They have been building First Church ever since.